Welcome to Adam's History Corner, where Steve and Jesse learn something new about the past.
Can you give a little background onto who actually discovered America? Not the Native Americans, because history decided that they don't count.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of Christopher Columbus and Life? Am I saying that correctly?
That would be the
Erickson?
Viking guy in the
Leif
11th
Erickson.
century, I think. Yeah. So, okay.
Do you
So
have any
first
insight
up,
on that?
let me just say this. It's weird that to say that humanity discovered North America in the last several centuries is a joke. Obviously, there were people here for several thousand years, and that happened when there was what we speculate was a land bridge between Asia and North America that was during a very cold period where people would have crossed the ice, come down through like the Yukon and Alaska and that sort of thing, and made their way into the North and South American continent. However, we're talking about European exploration, which is what I think he's talking about, which is for so long, the discovery of the Americas. I don't know much about Leif Erikson, but I do know that there were Viking settlements, and they found them in Newfoundland and other places where, the Vikings actually, sailed these longboats, which were not that long, maybe 100 feet long, and rowed them like across the Atlantic Ocean. And you think about that. In the 100 years ago or 120 years ago, it took several weeks to get across on a steamer. Like the Titanic was going to take a week at least. So you think about that, right? And so how long you're at sea for months in this tiny little boat, and the fact that anyone survived the journey that they had, they didn't know how many supplies they should bring. They didn't know what kind of water they should bring. They just sailed and said, "That's what we're going to do." Christopher Columbus.
How far we get?
Yeah, exactly. Can you imagine the boldness that you have to do something like that in a wooden boat?
And there's a handful of guys on that boat who aren't so worried about starving as much as they are worried about falling off the edge of the earth.
Right, because that's what they believed.
Yes.
Now, Christopher Columbus, who was actually an Italian, he basically theorized that the Earth was, I think, 4,000 kilometers smaller than it is, and he thought that if he sailed, they were discovering again in quotes, hard quotes, discovering India, that it existed, or rediscovering, because Alexander the Great had been in there and that sort of thing. So from a Eurocentric perception, how do we get all the riches of India, all the spices, the silks, the everything else that they loved about India and trading with India? How do we get that to Spain faster? And in fact, Christopher Columbus wanted to do that for Italy, but the Italians turned him down, and I think the French turned him down too. But the Spanish Empire, which was the greatest empire in the world at that time, said, "Yeah, we'll fund the expedition."
Wasn't it, stupid question, wasn't it the Portuguese?
Portuguese had a big empire as well, but Spain was, I think, more powerful at that point. At that point.
You know more than me.
Or was going to be anyway, was poised to be. So they send him this way, and he runs into North America, and he calls, we don't call them Indians anymore, but he calls them Indians because he thinks it's India. He thinks it's just the other side. And, I don't know, the 1492 Columbus sails the ocean blue. There is a lot about how we learn history that is convenient rather than factual. It's so that you get the basics of what happened for people that don't care, so that at least they know, okay, so I guess we've known about this place for 500 years, and I don't have to think about it ever again. I don't care. What's Kim Kardashian up to? What's my favorite hockey team up to? Most people just do not give a shit. So the way they teach history, oftentimes, because history requires nuance, it requires reading things, several different sources on the same subject, and it requires an ability and a desire to see things outside of the lens of the era that you grew up in. And so the reason Columbus is so easy is because he was the European from the not barbarian north, quote unquote again, that settled. And you have to remember this about the Vikings too. The reason that they never got any credit for quote unquote settling, because again, they didn't settle anything that was already settled. They just happened to show up and put some roots down as well. They didn't have a written language. So a lot of what we know about Viking culture, or what we think we know about Viking culture, is conjecture. We don't know all about the rituals. We don't know how they came up with their boats, how we came up with, we know how they built them, but we don't know who invented them. They just didn't have that sort of record keeping thing until missionaries went up into Denmark, into Sweden, into Finland, and Norway, obviously, and basically Christianized it. And it was a very vicious process when that happened. So when, Leif Erikson and from what I understand anyway, when that happened, it's hard to take credit for something if you don't write it down, especially back then. And I think that's probably why. And I bet you for 400 or 500 years, Europeans just had no idea that the Vikings had been there. And it's only recently that we're like, oh, hey, that's Viking stuff in North America. Weird. How could that have happened? And then you go. But that's all I have. I run out of steam.
That was very good.
Along the similar vein, the Easter Island heads is
weird,
really,
right?
It's an interesting.
Yeah,
where is that, Adam?
Easter Island is in is it off the coast of Nova Scotia? Isn't it Canada?
Let me look.
There's a really shitty History Channel show on it too. Curse of Easter. There's Oak Island, Easter Island.
Chile.
Oh wait, that's Chile. So I got my islands mixed up. But yes, the heads are crazy, and the story behind the heads is crazy.
Oh, those little head things, those rock head things.
Yes, because they go down like 20 or 30 feet.
Yes, so that's the crazy thing to me is, so the Easter Island heads exist. They're these giant rock heads on this island that I'm now looking. It's owned by Chile, I guess, but it's like in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, and these giant rock heads. They don't know how they got there, whatever, or at least for a while they didn't. And it was only recently, I want to say within like the last 5 years, maybe even 2, that they decided to dig around them, and they discovered, oh, they have entire bodies.
Yeah.
What?
Yeah.
What? How do you, what?
Yeah.
You didn't think to check? You didn't think to look? You didn't bring a shovel? What? That's insane. And then didn't I see something where maybe this we should research. Didn't I see something once where the theory they were looking through, or like their best research, is they were trying to figure, okay, where did these friggin' heads come from? And one of the things I saw was Africa.
It's possible. I mean, it had a thriving population. Like Timbuktu, at one point, was one of the preeminent trade capitals of the world in the 1500s.
Yeah, but Easter Island, nowhere near Africa.
Well, that's the thing, right? They were extremely wealthy.
Right.
Possible, right?
It's all fascinating. Some of that stuff that's just lost to history, or maybe not. Like it's lost to history for us now until we find it.